I pledge allegiance to the flag for which it stands under God. In God we trust. So the phrases under God and in God we trust were signed into law by Dwight Eisenhower. They were put into the Pledge of Allegiance and the money by Dwight Eisenhower. Before Dwight Eisenhower, those phrases under God and in God we trust were not there. They did not exist. Because the founders of the United States, they were terrible people, horrible, horrible slave owners and rapists and rich elitist snobs and jerks. They did one thing right, which is separation of church and state. They did want a secular government. And of course, another thing they did right was First Amendment freedom of speech. But those were the only two things they did right. But of course, Dwight Eisenhower came along and started eroding separation of church and state. Dwight Eisenhower started to destroy separation of church and state. And of course, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan exacerbated those matters. And of course, with all the ideologues on the Supreme Court and many other things happening, ideologues that were placed there by the Republican Party through generations of grassroots court packing initiatives. But Dwight Eisenhower really started the destruction of separation of church and state. So Dwight Eisenhower miraculously converted to Christianity during his presidential campaign because his advisor Billy Graham told him to. So it was a very opportunistic move to get religious people on his side, because initially religious people didn't like Dwight Eisenhower because he wasn't religious. He'd been atheist his whole life. A lifelong atheist who miraculously became religious during his presidential campaign. Sounds very familiar, actually. It's like it happened more recently, too, with a certain Republican candidate. But anyway, Dwight Eisenhower goes into office. He signs those orders into law. He puts under God and in God we trust in the Pledge of Allegiance and on the money. And Dwight Eisenhower pushes prayer in schools. Dwight Eisenhower further erodes separation of church and state by putting prayer in public schools. Dwight Eisenhower gives Billy Graham legitimacy, and Dwight Eisenhower makes Billy Graham spiritual advisor to the president, and Dwight Eisenhower holds these performative public prayers in his cabinet meetings, and Dwight Eisenhower even makes a big spectacle about religion and church in front of Nikita Khrushchev by attending church instead of going to a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. First of all, that is very insane because Soviet Union and the United States had a very tense relationship, so diplomacy and foreign policy was very important, but Dwight Eisenhower chose to do that publicity stunt, making a spectacle by going to church, rather than meeting with the leader of a very important nation, if you will. Soviet Union, horrible war criminal nation as well, just like the United States, but still, diplomacy would have been important, but instead Dwight Eisenhower just wanted to do a publicity stunt with the church, which he wasn't even that devoted to. Now, of course, this is horrible on its own, but Dwight Eisenhower is also a massive war criminal and a servant, a puppet of the military-industrial complex. Remember, Dwight Eisenhower criticized the military-industrial complex on his last day in office when it didn't matter, when he was going to face no consequences and when he had nothing to lose. Dwight Eisenhower finally, tepidly spoke out against them. It was a very weak, tepid speech. But of course, that is being used to rehabilitate him all the time. And people act like he was some sort of hero, which he wasn't. He was a World War II hero. He was a general in World War II. Of course, there was also reporting that Dwight Eisenhower denied food and proper food and water, proper food and care to prisoners of war. So that is questionable, to say the least. Very bad. And Dwight Eisenhower, of course, overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh of Iran. Dwight Eisenhower reinstalled the Shah, Pahlavi, who was a brutal dictator who would torture Iranian people. Dwight Eisenhower overthrew the government of Guatemala. Dwight Eisenhower started the permanent U.S. military occupation of Korea. Dwight Eisenhower began involvement in Vietnam. Dwight Eisenhower supported atrocities in Indonesia. Dwight Eisenhower, horrible, horrible president. Dwight Eisenhower hated the New Deal and started some deregulation processes that would have destroyed the New Deal over time, except, of course, Lyndon Johnson came in and completely destroyed all of that, and it was thanks to Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson that Dwight Eisenhower was not able to get as far. And, of course, later President Lyndon Johnson did the Great Society, which was New Deal on steroids, and really revitalized and made the New Deal much better and stronger. But of course, if Dwight Eisenhower and his policies had stayed around for like forever, then the New Deal would have been destroyed over time because of his deregulation and his limitation policies. So Dwight Eisenhower, in addition to all the horrible policies that he had and how terrible he was, he also destroyed the separation of church and state, which is having massive consequences now. He made the evangelicals politically relevant. So Dwight Eisenhower, terrible, terrible president who should never be rehabilitated.